If you were to say Access software to someone today, they would probably point you in the direction of some corporate website, or maybe think you were talking about Microsoft Access. But in the 8-bit 1980s, Access software meant something completely different. It meant video games, and pretty good ones too. But who were Access software? Whatever happened to them, and where are they now? Well, sit back and let me tell you the story of Access Software Incorporated. To tell this story, we need to go right back to 1982, where a 35-year-old Bruce Carver got into programming after buying a Commodore 64, after initially learning to program some years earlier at university. Bruce was born in Montpelier, Idaho in 1948 and graduated from Idaho State with a degree in engineering. By the time Bruce purchased his Commodore 64, he was already a successful engineer at Red Engineering, but it would be the entrepreneur in him that would take him down a different path. After hours of patience and a keen eye for detail, it wasn't long until Bruce Carver had created his first piece of software. However, this wasn't a game though. It was a sprite editing program called SpriteMaster, which he went on to sell in a local store. The success of SpriteMaster was enough for him to get his company started, and in 1982, Bruce Carver and Chris Jones created Access Software Incorporated. Chris Jones worked as a financial professional who became friends with Bruce Carver when they both worked at the same engineering company. Chris was born on the 4th of March 1955 in Salt Lake, Utah. From an early age, Chris grew up with a passion for making and starring in homemade movies that he made with his friends. Using a small camera, they made their own versions of pop culture movies such as Batman and Mission Impossible. However, his career would start in finance and was essentially the chief financial officer at Access Software. Although, in time, his role within the company would change and he would take on a more hands-on role, but more about that later. Access Software's first commercial game to be released was Neutral Zone in 1983. Neutral Zone lets you take control of a space-based missile battery where you have to protect the outpost from attacking aliens. The game allows you to pan a full 360 degrees like a tank turret. This was no mean feat at the time and required clever programming using techniques that he had to solve and develop himself to create the scrolling effect that he wanted. The game didn't get critical acclaim. In fact, Zap64 gave it one of the worst reviews around with a pretty shocking 9% overall a few years later in 1986. However, despite this, the game was successful. In fact, it was successful enough to allow Bruce to quit his day job at Red Engineering. Access Software were now definitely up and running. All they needed now was a hit. And later that year, that's what they got. Beachhead crashed onto our screens in 1983 and will be released across multiple 8-bit micros including the Commodore 64, Apple II, Amstrad CPC, ZX Spectrum and many more. The game is a World War II shoot 'em up based in the Pacific and sees you play through various stage minigames. Beachhead was also a 1 or 2 player game, so you could basically go head to head with your friend. The graphics were nice and the magazines loved it. All this helped it sell by the bucket load, and for US Gold, Access's European publisher, it was their first game to sell over 250,000 copies. In the early days, Access also published third-party titles such as Ollie's Follies and The Scrolls of Abaddon. Although in the long run, developing titles internally would be at the core of the business. 1984 would see Access prove that their success with Beachhead was no fluke when they released Raid over Moscow. The 1984 nuclear war game became one of Access Software's biggest selling titles, and the game was ported to various 8-bit machines at the time, despite gaining some negative political press and even being banned from former East Germany for being particularly militaristic and inhumane of nature. By now, Carver was gaining a reputation of being something of a programming guru. His attention to detail helped him wade through hours of programming books, and together with patience, he methodically poked and peeked through all 65,000 plus addresses of the Commodore system to learn what each of them did. This approach allowed him to literally map out the Commodore 64's capabilities and paid out dividends in years to come. It wasn't long until Access Software was pushing themselves even further. In 1985, Bruce Carver would work with his brother Roger Carver to create Beachhead 2: The Dictator Strikes Back. They decided between them that they needed to push the elements of realism for their first sequel. In the game's first level, paratroopers drop into the scene by helicopter, so in an attempt to gain a more realistic effect, they took a trip to the park and filmed themselves running and scaling walls. Individual frames from the footage was then traced and turned into sprites. Essentially, this would be an early attempt at rotoscoping in video games. Rotoscoping is an animation technique that allows animators to trace over motion picture footage frame by frame to produce a realistic action or movements. It's a process that was used in Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937 and started to be used in video games in the mid-80s. It's an effect that can really give games a distinctive look and feel. If that wasn't impressive enough, they worked with the company Electronic Speech Systems to create speech synthesis within the game. The familiar were created by the Access team themselves. This was not an easy task to incorporate into the game, as speech at the time could take up to half of the 6502 CPU cycles. In the end, all this work would pay off, as Beachhead 2 would become a commercial success, and again get ported to various 8-bit micros such as the Sinclair Spectrum, Amstrad CPC, Apple II and Atari 8-bit machines. By 1986, Access Software were enjoying the spoils of their success, with a bigger office and additional staff. This was also the year that Access Software would try something different, and bring us what is arguably their most iconic series of games. But the game that eventually got released nearly didn't happen in the way we came to know it. Bruce decided to take the company in a different direction and use the multi-minigame approach that he had perfected in Radar of Moscow and Beachhead and create a multi-sports game. The game would include 4 sports events, including baseball, soccer penalty kicks, and a closest to the pin golf challenge. Bruce, being an excellent golfer, decided to jump right in and start programming the golf minigame first. However, this would lead him down a rabbit hole, and by the time he was approaching completion, they all realised that they had a concept for a complete game, and voila! Leaderboard was born. The final game would put you right behind the golfer in a 3D style and allow them to use rotoscoping again to create a level of detail never seen in a game of this type. Access also released an expansion disc containing additional courses before releasing Leaderboard Executive and World Class Leaderboard the following year. The game would get rave reviews on various formats it was released on. And it wasn't limited to 8-bit machines either, as Leaderboard would get released on the Atari ST, Amiga, as well as making a leap onto video game consoles at the time. The game became the standard bearer for golf games on home micros in the 80s, to such a degree that if you said to your friend, "Do you want to play golf on the computer?" it pretty much meant, "Do you want to play Leaderboard?" And because it was up to 4 players, you can have some really good competitive games with your friends. As the end of the 1980s approached and the popularity of more powerful PCs and 16-bit machines such as the Atari ST and the Amiga grew, Access would again take direction with a more story-driven game with the development of Mean Streets. This is a game that would take advantage of more powerful hardware and that would spawn the Tex Murphy series of games. Being a bigger, more story-driven adventure game on more powerful computers meant a bigger production team and staff. The game would see more designers, artists and writers used for this game than any other Access game that had come before it. It was at this time that Chris Jones started to play a more direct role in the company by taking a writing role in the development of the games. The game would also see Chris portray the Tex Murphy character in the game's many digitised sequences throughout, which included capturing footage of Chris walking on a treadmill to create an 8-frame walk cycle that could be used in the game. The game itself is set in a near-future dystopian cyberpunk neo-noir world where Tex, a down-on-his-luck private investigator, is brought in to solve a murder in the style of a graphic adventure. Access was really pushing what was possible for the time in regards to gameplay and technical. The game even included side quests, and with the use of Access Software's patented real sound technology, you could hear all the digitized sounds via the internal speaker, negating the need for expensive sound cards.
What do you need, Murphy?
Mean Streets received praise for its graphics, freedom and more adult noir approach, and the title character Tex Murphy would get various sequels. The first of which would be Martian Memorandum in 1991, and was a more point-and-click adventure before going full motion video in 1994 with Under a Killing Moon. By 1996, portraying the character of Tex Murphy was allowing Chris to come into his own and live out his childhood fantasy by acting alongside Hollywood actors. The Tex Murphy games would take a lot of production effort and development, and Under a Killing Moon would cost over $2 million. However, it was always golf that Access Software would have a close interest in, and in 1990, Bruce and Roger Carver would take the experience gained developing Leaderboard and take it to the next level with the development of Lynx. Lynx would be released on the Amiga, the PC and the Sega CD, although the game was more at home on the more powerful MS-DOS and Sega CD platform. And during the game's development, Access Software programmers played the course, took hundreds of photos including aerial footage, thus allowing them to create the most accurate representation possible. As always, Carver would push the boundaries of what was possible to such a degree that some features had to be omitted from the final version. However, this wasn't enough to stop the game from receiving some criticism for the high system requirements to run the game, and the slow screen redraw time.
Nice par.
Despite the game's criticisms for its system requirements, the game also received seemingly endless praise for its attention to detail and realism, resulting in winning various awards at the time and cementing Access Software as being experts in golf software. 2 years later, the game would get an updated new version called Lynx 386, which included various updates, and eventually a Mac version was even released. It was around this time that Access Software and Microsoft started a publishing deal that would allow Microsoft to start adapting and publishing Lynx Golf under its own name, Microsoft Golf for Windows. By now, Access were concentrating their resources on their Tex Murphy and Lynx Golf games, allowing them to invest the development time needed to maintain their success. Towards the end of the 1990s, Access Software would take the knowledge they had gained in their golf genre and create a new company, True Golf, a subsidiary of Access that would concentrate on its golf products and expertise. In April 1999 though, Microsoft would buy Access along with its Lynx and Tex Murphy titles for an undisclosed sum. Carver would initially take a role within Microsoft and take the responsibility for expanding the Lynx franchise. In the year 2000, Microsoft rebranded Access Software as Salt Lake Game Studio, bringing an end to the Access Software name. And in 2003, it was rebranded again as Indie Built, before finally closing its doors in 2006 for good on this once glorious studio, and ending the story of Access Software. So, what happened to the two people that created Access Software, and where are they now? Well, Chris Jones would stay with the company right to the end and was Indie Built's chief financial officer until its closure in 2006. Jones kept a close connection with True Golf and also created Big Finish games, and would go on to keep the Tex Murphy games alive with the release of The Tesla Effect, a Tex Murphy adventure in 2014. This was done after a successful Kickstarter campaign in 2012. The game would also stick to its full motion video 3D style. In 2015, development started on the fifth title in the Tex Murphy series with The Poison Pawn. This game is still in development and is expected to have 4K graphics and support Oculus Rift, and essentially keeps the legacy of Access Software alive today. As for Bruce Carver, he left the company in 2003 to pursue other interests in True Golf and set up Carver Homes. It was said that Carver Homes allowed Bruce to satisfy his engineering passion for detail. Unfortunately, on December the 28th, 2005, Bruce died at the age of 57. And this is where our story of Access Software comes to an end. Personally, I spent many hours playing games by Access, particularly Beachhead 2 and Leaderboard in the mid-80s. These games allowed me to play against my friends or my dad. There was something about their games that made them so enjoyable. My dad and I would spend hours playing Leaderboard on my trusty Commodore 64. And maybe that's why I have so many fond memories of these games. But to be honest, they didn't have the best graphics in the world, and they didn't even have a memorable soundtrack. I think it was just Bruce Carver's meticulous detail, engineering mindset and skill at programming that would make playing these games so damn good. But what was the first Access game you came across, and which was your favourite? If you enjoyed this video, then you should consider subscribing to the channel. That way you will always be notified when I upload new content. And pressing the like button, well, that always helps as well. Until next time, thank you for watching and have a good evening. Goodbye.